Hi, my name is Ros Nealon-Cook. I'm a registered psychologist in the Greater Sydney area. I'm a mum and I'm a deeply concerned Australian citizen. This video is about COVID and the wider context in which it is occurring from a psychological perspective. First, there are two legal issues that must be addressed. Due to the gravity of the content of this video and reasonable concerns regarding potential censorship, advice has been given to me to place this material on official record. To do that, this video will be transmitted to the Attorney General of Australia and the Attorney Generals of each state of Australia. For physical backup, 2 copies of this material will be lodged and recorded as received at a local police station in the Greater Sydney area. This video will not be released to the public or the government until both of those have taken place. Secondly, I'm speaking to you today in the capacity of a New South Wales mandatory reporter, a legal obligation held in my professional capacity as a psychologist. Mandatory reporters are required by law to report when we become aware of any perceived risk of significant harm to children. I strongly urge all Australian mandatory reporters, including medical and health professionals, police officers, educators, religious ministry, and others, to critically engage with this material through the lens of your mandatory reporting duties. Importantly, for AHPRA registered health professionals, please note that mandatory reporting is a legal obligation. At law, your legal obligation to report risk of harm to children is superior to any requirements communicated from regulatory bodies, such as AHPRA, that may be attempting to censor and silence qualified opinion. So why am I making this video? Because after undertaking a great deal of research, it is my professional opinion as a psychologist that the children of New South Wales and Victoria and other areas subject to extended lockdowns are at a serious risk of harm as a direct result of the current management of the COVID pandemic. There are 8 forms of potential harm on which we must report, such as psychological abuse, neglect, and even danger to the unborn child. It is again my opinion that all these forms of harm have, at a population level, significantly increased for children and those yet to be born. Now, I'm coming through this lens of mandatory reporting, which only relates to children, as a mechanism to force this to be put on the public record. Beyond the risks of harm to children, most psychologists are fully aware that the effects on community mental health are horrific and unprecedented. Beyond the obvious widespread increases in anxiety and depression, we're seeing businesses close, relationships break down, sky-high rates of active addiction, new and those returning. We're seeing increases in self-harm, suicide ideation, domestic violence, PTSD in small kids, tragically, not to mention the huge increase, which is estimated at 3 times, in postnatal depression, which is a major risk factor in long-term mental health. These are not problems that are going to fix themselves in a few weeks once the pandemic is over. These are going to go on for decades and even generations with what we know about the intergenerational transfer of trauma. I've become aware there are many mental health professionals who are deeply concerned with these issues, however, have been too frightened to speak out for fear of losing their license. Now that I've explained the mandatory reporting obligations, it's my sincerest hope that this will now change. So today I'm going to briefly talk about 3 things. The first is the psychology of trauma or wartime and how it affects every single one of us. This is key to understanding. Point 2, misinformation is such a huge problem and has our community completely divided into 2 camps unnecessarily. Finally, I'd like to offer some suggestions to the government and hopefully the media too, in terms of how to communicate or how not to communicate when you're dealing with traumatized population. Because with respect, it's my and many others' opinion that current communications are actually making things far worse. You need to effectively communicate with the public so that hopefully the majority of the misinformation can be quickly knocked on the head and we can move on as a united force and deal with the horrific situation that we're currently in. Firstly, wartime psychology. Australia and much of the Western world is in a really unique point in history because prior to COVID, those of us who are under 80 and born in these lands have never been exposed to major life threats on home soil. This is really unusual in historical terms. We've had it so good for so long that we just don't realise this is occurring. Here's what's critical to understand, especially if we're effectively to deal with misinformation. When humans are under significant threat, there are enormous changes in the way that our brain and our nervous system process information. We go into what's often referred to as fight-flight, which is our human defense system aimed to protect us from life-threatening situations. Fight-flight is run by brain and body regions that operate unconsciously and are far more powerful than the more rational parts of the brain, like the prefrontal cortex. So your brainstem and amygdala, very primitive parts, divert resources to your heart and major muscles so that you can fight or run away from a life-threatening situation. At the same time, our prefrontal cortex is sort of dimmed down. And so the pinnacle of human thought, the problem-solving part, has been dimmed. You remember all those people that were scrambling for toilet paper, and you might have been thinking, what on earth are they doing? That makes no sense. It's because the rational part of their brain was dimmed and they were operating from a very primitive level. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this today, but you can just look up amygdala hijack, and there's a wealth of information out there. But it's vitally important to understand this, because when you understand that people, all of us, to some degree or another, are operating at a survival level, hopefully that will build empathy for others, because we're so divided right now. We've got families that are split, neighbours who aren't talking to each other. And whatever happens with COVID, it's the strength of our relationships that are key to getting through this. So just remember this. When we perceive major life threat, our rational thinking is dimmed down as our body attempts to keep us alive. And by the way, anyone who wants to argue the Yerkes-Dodson point here, I would just counter that that's long gone. And I'm happy to argue that point separately. When rational thought is dimmed, probably the most problematic part is that it narrows our focus. It makes us tunnel vision. It reduces the brain power required to sort of compare 2 points of view and to weigh up situations. It's like our brain's bandwidth has been reduced to make it more efficient. So we can't see the field. We can't look at all these different perspectives and respectfully engage with them. And this is one of the main reasons we've ended up with these two groups, two sides, which is, it just makes no sense. And neither can understand each other. It's sort of, why can't you understand? Why won't you wake up? You just need to read the science. Both sides thinking the others are mad. So the point is, people aren't choosing to deliberately ignore your point of view. Their brain doesn't have the capacity to take on different information. The final point here is that this impacts everyone. Everyone has gone more tunnel vision to a greater or lesser extent, but all of us are vulnerable to misinformation. No one is immune. Not you, not me, not anyone in government, not Alan Jones. Even if you're emeritus professor in pure maths, you cannot educate yourself out of this survival response. It will always dominate. In fact, there's a very real danger that many, not all, but many of those with the highest levels of education may be even more vulnerable to narrowed field and misinformation because they're used to being right all the time. So there's also ego buy-in. So if this is you, please check your ego at the door and try and observe objectively what I'm about to show you. Remember Kuhn and his paradigm change. Great thinkers tend to struggle with new information. Please try to be objective. Now to the second point, which is considering how our reduced cognitive power can be so destructive when we're trying to manage a crisis, to problem solve and to deal with conflicting information. You remember that keep calm and carry on meme? It's because after back-to-back wars, the English government knew that you can't lose your cool in dangerous times for exactly the reasons I've just outlined. Now, until yesterday, I'd been working on producing materials myself, but it was simply taking too long. So what I'm going to show you now is a sort of cut and paste of other people's media. It's a bit clunky, but at the end of the day, lives are at risk, so it doesn't matter how pretty it is. Here's the first piece.
Dr. Joseph Barone is a man who worked more than 400 days straight on a quest against the most frightening virus of our lifetime.
How many interviews have you conducted with the media over the pandemic?
With this one is 1,640 since March 19 of last year.
But almost every outlet has failed to note the dramatic difference in the COVID-19 death rate between Dr. Barone's patients and those at other hospitals across the nation and the world. According to the numbers, Dr. Barone is saving a lot more lives.
We have implemented a series of treatment methods that have a very good success rate.
What is he doing differently? Barone says most journalists didn't want to ask.
Ivermectin. The combination of the MAD plus, including the ivermectin, was having fantastic success with our patients. It's an agent that has been around for 40 years. It's an anti-parasite, however, it has very potent antiviral and anti-inflammatory properties. And it actually has been shown to improve the outcome of patients with COVID, as well as prevention of COVID. I'm sure you are familiar with the newest data from India and from Mexico, where actually in those states where they have given ivermectin prophylactically, there are much less number of COVID cases.
You have peer-reviewed research on this?
Yes, correct. And we actually, one of the studies that I sent you was a study that looked at every study out there, a study that looked at all the available evidence, and everything favored the use of ivermectin.
Hydroxychloroquine was also part of Dr. Barone's COVID-killing recipe for the first 6 months of the pandemic. A crunch of the numbers at that time showed the death rate from COVID at his hospital was just 4.4% compared to a death rate of around 20% at other hospitals.
And our mortality rates were remarkably low. And these people were equally sick to the people in other hospitals.
The H word came up in my first interview with him, August 10th, 2020.
We use it with good success. We know that there is a lot of controversy. But one of the problems that we have is that we use a lot of things. We literally throw the whole kitchen sink at these patients because they're so sick. So sometimes you don't know exactly what makes a difference.
Shortly before that interview, studies came out saying the drug was neither harmful nor helpful in the treatment of COVID-19. Subsequently, my interview with Dr. Barone faced immense backlash from Fox Corp.
You need to cease and desist posting about hydroxychloroquine.
It's not just about the viewers, it's about what our CEO reads. It's about what our GM reads.
And like we said, it's not about the viewers right now.
Everything's going to be under the microscope.
At the same time, Barone faced scorn in his industry.
Because as a clinician that is trying to save lives, it's annoying. It's annoying because we're trying to help people. We're not trying to hurt people.
He phased hydroxychloroquine out, but kept using ivermectin along with the steroid, blood thinner, vitamins, and avoiding ventilators like the plague. And what about Dr. Barone's patients who took those controversial drugs? How are they doing?
I feel fine. I've never had any of the long hauler effects.
So you took one of the most controversial drug.
Right, hydrochloroquine, the vitamins and ivermectin, the Math Plus protocol.
He had me on the Math Plus protocol.
You've heard the stories of people like you who died.
Yeah, seen it. It's a lot of it.
Manuel Espinoza, a urologist from Harlingen, Texas, says he probably wouldn't be alive today had he not been emergency airlifted across the state to Dr. Barone.
How close to death do you think you were?
Pretty close. I had about a third of my lung on one side and probably about a quarter of lung availability on the other side. With the, the classic Resdemivir and the plasma, they started to see kind of a slow decline.
Espinosa's wife had come across the Math Plus protocol online after spending Christmas week in the local hospital. He was transferred to Houston.
And I can tell you, within hours, turned around within days, just immense improvement.
There is no reason for people to die. I mean, we have options for patients now. We just need to make those options available.
Dr. Barone was a principal investigator in the recent peer-reviewed research that looks at ivermectin's effectiveness in the treatment and prevention of COVID-19, published in the American Journal of Therapeutics.
Dr. Pierre Corey led the research on ivermectin, co-authored by Dr. Barone and others.
But we know it's highly effective if given early. You can get ahead of this and reverse this disease in days.
Dr. Pierre Corey went in front of Senate to fight it.
I am severely troubled by the fact that the NIH, the FDA, and the CDC, I do not know of any task force that was assigned or compiled to review repurposed drugs in an attempt to treat this disease.
Even his testimony in front of Senate was brought down from YouTube.
The censorship of scientific research on COVID drug treatments is happening across news media and social media.
So tell me about what happened with your peer-reviewed research when you put it on Facebook.
Every time I use the word ivermectin, I go to Facebook chain.
You put out this peer-reviewed research in late April. How much coverage did that even get?
Exactly zero in the United States. Right? The United States is in a media lockdown.
So if this word got out, would more lives be saved?
Absolutely, without question about it. But how can you get the word out if I have not been able to do it in 1,600 or plus interviews?
And that paper was peer-reviewed. It's publicly available knowledge by 2 senior scientists at the FDA and a senior scientist at the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. These are major governmental scientists, and it was a rigorous peer review. Right now, there's actually a legal action by the Indian Bar Association against the chief scientist of the WHO for her statements against ivermectin, because they've learned to ignore the WHO. And I can show you the graph. So the states that ignored the WHO, so the state of Goa, Uttar Pradesh, which has had the most aggressive use of ivermectin since August, and they have the best numbers in India. The states in India with aggressive use and adopted into their guidelines have precipitous declines in cases and deaths. And when you compare it to the one state in India that did not adopt it, they are out of control. And that's Tamil Nadu in southern India.
I truly believe that what we're dealing here is with economical interests. Throughout the world, ivermectin is anywhere between $3 and $10. Remdesivir, $2,000 to $6,000. One of the reasons why I allowed the media to come in is because it was very important to tell the public what was going on. A lot of people didn't believe what was going on. I thought that it was important for people to see what was going on in an attempt to decrease the number of people that would end up in the hospital.
Had there been an existing known safe and effective treatment for COVID-19, emergency use authorization of a vaccine for the virus would be prohibited by law. I'd like to know why so few journalists seem to report on what is happening at the human level, opting instead to report what a bureaucrat tells them.
That's going to be new information for many of you. And if you are sitting there completely dumbstruck, so was I when I first saw these sorts of materials. Critical point that she ends with: if there is an existing and safe treatment for COVID, emergency use authorization of vaccines is legally prohibited. Yet those vaccines that everyone's currently queuing up for en masse are only available because they've got emergency use authorization. The first of the clinical trials doesn't complete until early 2023, which means these vaccines are experimental in nature. The final video I'll show you now is much shorter and more summary in nature. It did come with dramatic music, and I don't know how to remove that. And as I've shortened it, it sounds a bit clunky. But here it is.
Who have planned this? It's all planned. Now, why they planned this, I don't know. And I don't even think I want to know.
One of our problems here is the assumption that this is like every other vaccine we've ever seen, and it's not.
This started to come together, and we started to get kind of a sick feeling in our stomachs that, wait a minute, this is science gone bad here. None of this is supposed to be happening.
50% of healthcare providers are absolutely not getting this injection. We don't trust the data. The fox guarded the hen house. The companies did their own data. There were no independent observer groups.
But they said we're being pressured in-house to add COVID to the diagnostic list, when we think it has nothing to do with the actual cause of death.
It's another level now of criminality.
There's a lot of other doctors who feel the same way. Well, they're too frightened to speak up. And as soon as that happens, a notification, and you're in front of the medical board.
Dr. Robert Malone is a vaccine expert. He is the inventor of mRNA technology. He's undergone systematic attack. His history is literally being erased online. He's fact-checking groups, for example, factcheck.org. They're funded by an organization that holds over $1.8 billion of stock in a vaccine company.
They are trying to push a narrative that is not based on the decades of immunology.
People have turned to Facebook to share their stories and experiences, with one group reaching almost 65,000 members. It was removed overnight for no apparent reason.
The victims of this vaccine, they're not being able to tell their story.
Well, the censoring has been going on for well over a year. It's well documented. It's unequivocal.
The Great Barrington Declaration, authored and signed by 3 of the world's leading experts in epidemiology, infectious diseases, and vaccines.
We've got to the point where scientists such as yourselves need to kind of gather for secret meetings in houses to come out with declarations of dissent.
Are you of the same opinion?
I don't think I can answer that question.
Why not?
Anyone who speaks out against this line of policy is shut down. I basically have to be in line with the government line.
You have to realize the number of doctors and scientists who are saying no to all this outnumbers those who are saying yes. The number of doctors and scientists who are saying no to all this outnumbers those who are saying yes.
We, the Germans, are asking this question how it happened in the 1930s. And a lot of people are now getting a sense how it happened.
We're held hostage to more and more mutations that can be used to manipulate us over and over again and take away our freedoms.
We've used these tactics in other countries to manipulate, divide and conquer. Now we're watching our own government, our own military use them against us. Men of our unit in our service believe that we're pointing our weapons in the wrong direction. This time now the tyranny is against us and our people, and we can't see it because it's on our home soil where it's never been before.
We need to start looking at ourselves as officers and thinking, is what I'm doing right? You don't get to just say, I'm following orders. And if that costs you your job, so be it. At least you'll be able to look at yourself in the mirror at night.
In Australia, people have had it too good for too long, and they see these communist countries, and there's no way that could happen here.
We are the most locked down country in the world.
What you've just seen may have been deeply shocking. It certainly was for me. And I even spent huge amounts of time trying to find evidence that this wasn't the case, because it seemed so outrageous. But the more I looked, the more I found. And what I've shown you represents a tiny portion of the vast numbers of highly credentialed scientists and medical folk who are screaming for this to stop. I'm not assigning blame to anyone in our government. I know many in New South Wales are furious and taking their anger out on Gladys Berejiklian. However, to me, she appears to be operating from a place of high integrity, trying to protect us. She's certainly exhausted, but outrageously, it looks like she's been receiving very low quality scientific information. The other Australian medical folk we see on TV every day, I simply don't know what's happened there. Maybe they couldn't access this information for the same reason most of us haven't been able to, because it's censored in all mainstream media. And for those who think, like I used to, yeah, but I don't watch commercial TV. I only watch the ABC or SBS. And who'd ever listen to Alan Jones and his rants? This is almost the biggest blind spot of all, and it was one I was prey to for a long time. We are in completely different times, and the way we used to think and how we used to interact with information is completely different right now. So I'll end now with some requests for different groups, and please know they are all delivered from my position as a mandatory reporter, someone who absolutely wants to protect the children. It's really a position we should all be operating from at this point in time, whether we're mandatory reporters or not. Because really, you don't have to look very far to see that this has destroyed so many children's lives on so many different levels. And even if this stopped tomorrow, a lot of that can't be reversed. To the media. I don't know what's behind the censorship, but I will just say that prior to working as a psychologist, I spent many years in corporate. I've got a degree in computer science and I've written research in AI. So those combined careers mean I am fully aware that your hands are not clean. 21st century media is programmed to be as dramatic and addictive as possible and is driven by profits, KPIs and bonuses, which unfortunately mean integrity can fly out the window. So I strongly urge the media to consider 2 points, and please, when listening to this, take off your corporate hat and just listen as a human, as a parent, as an auntie, as an uncle, from the heart. Number 1, please reduce the drama. And please don't mock people. Don't call people conspiracy theorists in your headlines or crazy lunatics. It's not helpful at all. And it's actually a big part of why our community is so divided in this way. Mocking and ridiculing people's beliefs is never going to turn them to a different way of thinking. What it does is further activate their fight-flight system. So it's essentially just making things worse. And the second point, and again, this is to human beings, please get yourself out of this debate. This is the most urgent scientific debate of our times. And I don't care if you thought you were doing the right thing. It is not your place to veto medical expertise. It's not my place. We don't have that sort of knowledge. So step out and leave it to the experts. To the government, with respect for your endeavours to keep us safe, as you can see, there are many very highly credentialed experts who are strongly arguing that the current Australian policy is not only highly flawed, mostly unnecessary, but causing far more harm than this virus was ever going to the working aged or younger healthy population. What's more, your measures are actually reducing people's natural immunity for multiple reasons and making all of us more vulnerable to a huge range of other health challenges. So I call on the government as a mandatory reporter, please engage with this material immediately. Every day, the mental health costs are increasing and every day people are dying. Get the major scientific arguments on the table. Let them punch it out publicly, now. Ideally with full publicity. We need to know of any potential conflicts of interest, previous disciplinary action in their fields, that sort of thing. There are multiple scientists screaming at us not to vaccinate children and pregnant women until much more research has been undertaken. I mean, pregnant women, surely we've been here before with thalidomide. We know how things can go terribly, terribly wrong. And to be clear, I'm fully vaccinated. I always have been. I plan to have my COVID shots, of course, but I've been quite ill in the last few months and delayed them until I was stronger. But now, having heard all these censored scientific experts, there is no way I'm going to have these shots until it's been publicly debated that 1, it's safe, and 2, that it's even necessary. Current policy involves highly coercive and manipulative techniques to get people jabbed as quickly as possible. You must hear the other side, because if these other scientists are right and you don't listen, your hands are covered in blood. To parents who are listening, the mums especially, because 99.99% of us would fight to the death to protect our kids. There's a current push to get older children vaccinated as a top priority, yet we know that a small number of children have died as a result of this vaccination. Yes, it's a very small risk, but personally as a mum, I won't accept any risk unless it's defending against an enormous threat. Please, from the bottom of my heart, if you are planning on vaccinating your child, please make sure you're extremely well versed in this controversy. And please don't feel pushed or harassed by anyone to do so. Finally, to the other health professionals and mandatory reporters, please know there are huge numbers of your colleagues and specifically created non-profit organisations in Australia and around the world representing medical, legal, law enforcement and other groups who are doing their utmost to demand immediate open debate and an end to medical censorship. I'll show some of these groups now in some final slides. Please seek them out if you're concerned and join them. There are many, many more. I'll provide links in the description of the sites where this video is housed. Thank you.